Without any further ado, I'd like to give the floor over to David Rosen, who has been a longtime supporter of adult literacy and adult basic education nationally, but here in New Jersey as well. We gave him the Leadership Award the President's Award a couple years ago, and he's been a constant presence at our conference and also with these online webinars. So I'm looking forward to seeing what David has to share with everybody today. So thanks again, David.
Thanks, Eric. And this looks like a great lineup for the webinars. You'll probably see me again several times. I'm eager to hear what Steve has to say, Steve Reeder and Marisol and others. So let's launch into this. I'd like to just call your attention to the title of this webinar. Obviously, what the goal is increasing funding for adult basic skills. And how to do that? Well, the keys are well organized, strategic, and never let go. And that means even after you have a success, it's not over. It's year in and year out. As a public policy committee chair in Massachusetts years ago said, it's like being a bulldog, never let go. So here are some of the topics that we're going to try to get to today. What is public policy? Why is it important? Where has it been effective and why? What should we be advocating for? What are the lessons learned from our efforts? And are there any new opportunities in 2017 that we should know about? And indeed there are. Finally, just are there other resources? If you want to learn more about adult basic skills advocacy efforts, what can you do to further that? So what I'd like to do is just give you a quick definition, my own actually, of what public policy advocacy is. So it's presenting arguments for a particular piece or kind of legislation or policy. It could be at the local, state, federal level. Often it's an organized set of activities by an advocacy group or organization. It can involve lobbying, but it doesn't need to. And that's a really important point. It does not need to. And there are some people who believe, based on their experience over many years, that it doesn't even have to have lobbying. It can be pure advocacy. And I'll say a little bit more about what that looks like. That advocacy can involve meeting with legislators, of course, but also contacting them by letter, postcard, email, telephone, and other ways. And basically the idea is for constituents, and that's the key, for constituents to let their views be known to their legislators. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why public policy advocacy is important, but before I do, I'd like to hear from you. Why do you think public policy advocacy is important? So just type your answers into the questions and answers box. In this case, answers.
Yes, but you could also raise your virtual hand if you'd like to speak directly about why you think why do you think public policy advocacy is important?
So we'll give it a minute.
Yeah.
And then Eric, you'll read those to me, I assume?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, I will. And just so everybody knows, once the webinar is done, we'll be sending out a PDF of the PowerPoint, and I'll also be able to collect some of people's ideas and share those as well, in addition to getting a certificate of attendance and professional development credit for an hour. And the webinar itself will be archived and uploaded to our YouTube channel. I always feel that, when you're in a classroom and you're attending to wait time, it feels natural, that you can walk around and kind of see what people are doing and thinking. But wait times in webinars are somewhat awkward because there's just silence. And we tend to not be comfortable with silence in this country.
So the question is, Why is public policy advocacy important?
Yeah. Should we, if people don't have ideas that are kind of readily coming out that they want to be able to articulate, maybe we can move on. Oh, or here some people come in.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So Thomas notes that public policy is extremely important because our politicians dictate how the money is spent. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point.
We just had a ballot initiative in our state, sort of dedicating tax money generated by gas taxes to go to transportation and infrastructure.
Hmm.
How, what did you just say? How yours just disappeared quickly for some reason? So then Michael says that I would guess it's important to let the public know about an important issue, right? So that the advocacy is not simply with the legislators, but it's with the public, right? That's going to back up the initiatives.
That's a very important point. Um, if you can't affect public opinion, you may not be able to persuade legislators. If they're hearing about the same issue from a lot of their constituents because public opinion is changing, that's very important. That'll make a
Right.
big difference.
Right. And Phyllis just commented that without public policy advocacy, how would legislators know what their constituents care about and what's important to them?
Right.
Right.
Good.
Okay.
So these are all good points. I have a couple of other things I wanted to call your attention to. Without public policy advocacy for adult basic skills, some states, and New Jersey may be among them, will have little or no funding for adult basic skills. Important point. Um, and in most states, the majority of funding comes from the state, not from the federal government. So that's really something to pay a lot of attention to. If you want to see funding for your program increase, or if you want funding for your program, it's public funding is going to come in most likely from the state, and then to a much lesser degree from the federal government, and possibly also, depending on the kind of program you have, from local sources. Another point is a lot of states organize public policy when they are facing a crisis. California, I'll talk about in a little while. That's a good example. But if you wait to do that until you have a crisis, you're going to take a huge budget cut, and then you're going to have to claw your way back to whatever the current norm is. And that's true. I've seen that happen again and again. California is the most recent and most severe case of that. But it could happen anywhere, in any state. And then finally, with systematic and effective year in and year out advocacy, states have generally seen increased and sustained growth in funding, and sometimes also program improvements. So let's talk about some places, some states, 3 states and New York City, where there have been some victories recently. I'm going to talk about California first because that's quite an interesting story. First of all, before 2008, California was perhaps the best funded adult education program in the entire country, with most of the funding being provided by state and local school district matching funds. California alone provided the lion's share of matching funds for the federal funds, for OCTAE funds from the U.S. Department of Education. And then in 2008 and 2009, that funding took a huge hit. And what happened is during the fiscal year 2008-2009, the California Department of Education had provided upwards of, get ready for this, folks, upwards of $750 million in state funding for adult education. Now, granted, California is a big state, but that is still, I mean, that's way more money than Texas or Alaska has ever spent on adult ed. However, the problem was spurred by the recession and large budget shortfalls. The California legislature in 2009 relaxed the spending, restrictions on more than 40 education categorical programs, and one of the big ones, was adult education. And what happened then is, since in California a huge proportion of adult ed was funded through what are called adult schools, you're familiar with that in New Jersey, you've had them at various points. What happened is the school districts were given the power to use the adult education funds and other restricted categories in any way they wanted to make up their shortfalls for K through 12. So from 2009 to 2012, over half of California's adult education programs either got shut down or dramatically curtailed services. Sound familiar? I think you've experienced that in New Jersey, if I recall correctly. So that's the bad news, but there is some interesting good news following that. What happened is a combination of three things. One is, and from my perspective, the most important, is suddenly there was widespread adult basic skills advocacy by both of the large major California organizations that do public policy advocacy for adult basic skills. Without that, there would be no good news. Secondly, and this certainly helped, a new governor, Jerry Brown, who was responsive to the messages from this huge campaign that they launched. And then the third is the willingness of both the public schools and the community colleges, the largest providers of adult ed. These organizations had never worked closely before. And Jerry Brown said, okay, you'll get new money, but you have to work together. And you have to create regional consortiums. And their willingness to do that, the advocacy, and a responsive governor led to, at this point, a restoration of about 2/3 of the funding, which is pretty dramatic in a relatively short period of time. And it's very likely that they're going to see more increases in funds. And already, some of the advocates agree that they have a better integrated system of services. Of course, more still needs to be done. But that is one example of the power of advocacy on a huge scale, millions and millions of dollars, $500,000. I'm sorry, $500 million, not $500,000. So another example is the tiny state of New Hampshire. And we'll hear from New Hampshire in several ways in this presentation. The voice of Art Ellison, who wears many hats. One of his hats is the State Director of Adult Basic Education for New Hampshire. And Art posted a message to a adult basic skills advocacy group that I'll tell you about later, an online advocacy group. And I'm just going to read you what he said. He said, with the increases in state funding over the past 10 years, our yearly per adult learner expenditure has increased about 40%. We've received increases in state funding for almost every year of the 37 years that I've been in this position as state director. Some have been small, 7% for each of the last 2 years, for example, but some were much larger, quite often in the 10 to 15% range. With the change in the compulsory school age from 16 to 18 in 2008, we received a 40% increase in funding since we were the primary program providing educational services to 16 and 17-year-olds who were dropping out of school but would now be required to stay. So New Hampshire's had a lot of success, and Art would be the first person to tell you it is due almost entirely to an extremely well-organized, widespread, year in and year out advocacy campaign by adult basic education teachers, administrators, and most important, students. Okay, a third case, Massachusetts. I'm not going to say a lot about that now because I'm going to come back to that later. Massachusetts is by state, and so I can tell you over a period of 2 decades, the per student, what I like to say investment, some people say cost or expenditure, but I think it's an investment, has gone from under $100 per student per year in the 1980s when I got involved with adult basic education to its current level, which has been pretty level for several years, at $2,000 per student per year. So that's a huge increase. And incidentally, that reflects combined state and federal funding. 75% of that funding is state funding. So that's really where the increases have come, not from federal funding, but from state funding. And then finally, and there are other examples I could give, but in the interest of time, just one more. And that's your neighbor across the river, New York City. And Ira Yankwit, who some of you may know, the director of the Literacy Assistance Center of New York, posted a message about their activities this year in the group that I'll tell you about a little later that you may be interested in joining. And Ira said that the New York City Coalition for Adult Literacy, NYCAL, I believe it's called, membership-based advocacy organization comprised of adult literacy program managers, teachers, students, and allies from community-based organizations, from City University of New York, campuses, umbrella organizations, and library literacy programs across New York City, has as its goal to increase city and state funding for adult literacy and to have a voice in adult literacy policy decisions. This year, NYCAL succeeded in securing $12 million in the city of New York, specifically for adult literacy education. That represents a minimum of 2.5 times the fiscal year 16 funding level. So we need to give a big applause to the neighbors across the river. They've had fabulous victory this year. To achieve that victory, they pursued what's called an insider-outsider strategy. They worked closely with their champion in the city council and key adult literacy stakeholders in various city agencies. They testified at city council hearings. They held rallies, demonstrations at City Hall, which, by the way, is a way to affect public opinion. And they made their case through the local press, also a way to affect public opinion, the point that was raised by one of our participants earlier. Incidentally, if you're interested in finding out more about that particular campaign, you could go to nycalliteracy.org. That's nycalliteracy.org, nycalliteracy.org with 2 C's. And so those are the 4 examples, but over the years, other cities have had significant investments in adult basic education. Philadelphia still has the Mayor's Commission on Literacy. Still, it's gone through how many mayors since it started, and still committed, significant commitment. Boston is another case of that. Let's see, 1983 is when the Boston mayoral initiative was created. And it's still going strong. Hartford, Connecticut, and other cities as well. So don't overlook, if you're in a city in New Jersey, don't overlook the possibility that there could be a stronger, if you already have a citywide initiative, and if you don't, that you could have one, and it could make a big difference in funding and also in quality. So in nearly all of the state cases and in New York City, these increases were brought about by the state or urban coalitions of adult basic skills advocates. Every one of these has included adult learners and graduates. I can't say that enough times, adult learners and graduates. Usually they have involved the following 4 strategies. The organizing group, first of all, early in the year, usually in the fall, determines what's called, in advocacy work, is called the ask. And it might be, for example, a line item increase, a new piece of legislation, or if you don't have a state line item for adult basic skills, the ask is a line item. It's legislative language which makes the state responsible for adult basic education. You may have that in New Jersey, I don't know. Sometimes the ask, by the way, is developed by working closely with advocates in the state legislature, what we call champions for adult literacy. We'll talk about champions a little bit more later. So the statewide organizing group has to assure that everyone's on the same page with the ask. If you have 3 or 4 groups advocating and they're advocating for different things, they cancel each other out. That is the worst, most disappointing, most sad situation you could possibly create. And what happens is legislators who get asks from other groups on other important issues all the time basically shake their head and say, get your act together and come back when you have it. So one state organizing group, or if there's more than one, they're working together very closely in determining what the ask is. So there's one ask, it's very clear, very consistent, the message is the same from all the advocates. So the organizing doesn't just stay in that committee. It involves reaching every program and ideally every student and graduate. Practitioners and students contact their legislators to support whatever the ask is, the line item or the new legislation, whatever it is that you're asking for. So I'm going to stop here for another question to you, and that is, and I'll talk about this too, but I want to hear from you first. What is it that you should be advocating for? Or what is it that we as a field should be advocating for? And again, you can raise your hand or you can type it in the question and answers box.
Yeah, and I think the question is both nationally, what should we be advocating for, but also here specifically in New Jersey, what are some concerns that we have that we really need to advocate for? And as David said, not simply from kind of a triage or reactive mode, but thinking long term, what is it that we want to have as a system?
Yes,
And then,
absolutely.
after we speak a little bit about that, Hal Beater, who's also on the board of the New Jersey Association for Lifelong Learners and is also on Scales, will say something about some of the work that NJAL is trying to do around advocacy in New Jersey. So Jessica says, very straightforward, we need state funding dedicated to adult literacy. Yes, indeed. The the key issue in New Jersey, I think. Hal says increased funding and funding dedicated to serving low-level learners. Certainly, this issue about serving low-level learners has been on people's radars with WIOA. You know, even though WIOA is supposed to be dedicated to serving vulnerable populations, it seems like the accountability matrices certainly put low-level learners in vulnerable position. Terry adds that there's not enough position. Phyllis notes more funding for quality second chance programs. Phyllis, I think the key word there is quality, right? So that we can have money for programs, but if they're not funded to the level that they need to be, then they can't actually provide the types of services they need to. Gordon notes more funding per adult students, that their students need, deserve, and are worth it. And so then Terry points out she has 2 classes, all mid-level learners, but nothing for the lower level learners. And this is something that New Jersey Association for Lifelong Learning has been quite concerned about with the changes in WIOA, and we're not alone nationally about the condition that lower level learners might find themselves in under WIOA. So those are all very, very important things.
You know, they absolutely are, and these are exactly on target. I just want to make one comment here. I think New Jersey now may be the only state that doesn't have a line item for adult basic education.
Yeah, I think that's
Colorado didn't for forever, and then about 2 years ago they got a small, I think it was like 750,000 or $1 million. Iowa didn't, and I think they have a small line item now. So New Jersey, unfortunately, may be sadly unique in this.
We might have gone from 48th in spending to 50th. Woohoo! Um, so Terry points out that she's in Atlantic County, and there's many former casino employees that are mostly low level, right? So certainly, I think really profound shifts in the economy are creating vulnerability among the working poor and the working class, and so right, we need to worry about what kind of services are going to be provided to them. Hal, I'm going to unmute you and ask if there's other things that you wanted to highlight from a NGEL perspective or from a scales perspective. Are there other aspects of adult education that we need to be advocating for either in New Jersey or nationally?
Yes. I think an important point is that the nature of the funding you get is very important. New York, for example, has a very, very strong level of adult education funding, which is tied to enrollment. So that means as the more students they serve, the more money they get. New Jersey has a small amount of state money, but it's tied to the state employment fund. So when things were really fat and employment was really high, that was a nice funding source. Now it's almost bankrupt. Year by year funding, some of our adult high school funding was uh, re- refunded for a year, but it's year by year funding, so it's always in jeopardy. So I'm saying that when you're looking for the funding source, look at something that's easy to protect and as most stable as possible. Uh, New Jersey has a interesting structure. Uh, the operational arm for WIOA is our Department of uh, Labor and Workforce Development, called LWD, and the policy group, which is separate from LWD by law, is our State Employment and Training Commission, SETC. SET was responsible for developing our state plan. Uh, it's an interesting bit where the policy and the operation are separated. New Jersey All historically has worked through the system. Uh, we, for example, have an entity called the State Employment, the New York Literacy uh, Scales Council. That's an adult education council which is written into law, which is attached to the SETC. So, and we have mandated membership on that council from uh, New Jersey All. Working through the system, through scales, through our contacts in the administration, puts us at the table, and I think we have been at the table meaningfully in the past. But at the same time, people in LWD, SCTC get very, very upset when they get calls from legislatures. So if we work through the legislature, we get kicked off the table. So that's an important conundrum. Working through the system on one hand and working through the legislature on the other, very hard to do in New Jersey at the same time. In New Hampshire, the state director is very much tied into the legislature, and there's no big barriers there. But New Jersey, that's been a big problem for us. So one of the things that we're grappling with now is whether we should abandon our policy or listen, maybe not abandon it, but play it down with the system and make a bigger play through the legislation. And I think if we're going to get more funds, we're going to have to do that because we're not going to get more funds from our current administration or any other administration unless the legislature mandates
So
Hal,
I
thank
think,
you.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
so I think that's a really important point that Hal's making, kind of a shift in the way that NJL is trying to approach this, because it really relies upon uh, successful outreach and organization of people in counties all around the state, right? So, kind of before this point, it was kind of develop a focused message and go through LWD, go through scales. And so the size didn't matter as much. But now going through the legislature, size is going to be crucial, right? The number of constituents, the number of learners, the number of graduates that are mobilized to go to Trenton to talk to people in the local area is going to be really, really important. So a few years ago, Angel shifted from being a dues paying member organization to being a participant model. We sort of feel like if you come to the webinars, if you come to the conference, if you're involved in Angel activity, then you participate in the life of Angel. And you don't have to send in $25 to consider yourself a member of Angel. So I think as part of this, membership and participation hopefully is going to start to orient itself towards these more large scale mobilizations of people around these issues.
Mm-hmm.
I think David's earlier point was absolutely critical too, that this has to be an ongoing activity, not just a crisis-oriented activity, because crises do come and it's easy to mobilize people around a crisis, but you don't have the resources to bear in a crisis unless you've had the context and the experience on an ongoing basis.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm reminded actually of how I got involved in adult basic skills advocacy. It was in the 1980s when I first got a grant for my program. I was the director of education, and we got a grant from the Department of Education in Massachusetts. And I went to, one of the required meetings, first of many, and I was kind of a loudmouth then. And so I stood up and I said, you're talking about improving quality here. This is ridiculous. The average expenditure per student per year is $47 per student per year. That's outrageous. How can you ask us to improve quality? How can you ask us to deliver any kind of quality with that amount of money? And the response, well, first of all, I shocked everybody in the room, except, interestingly, the person who was representing the Department of Education. And she said, well, let me respond to you by saying, I completely agree with you, but there's nothing I can do about it because I am forbidden by law to advocate on behalf of adult basic education since I'm a state employee. You, on the other hand, don't have that same prohibition. And it was eye-opening for me. It was the beginning of a long career in advocacy. And I think that's a really important point. It may not play out quite that way in every state. It may not play out quite that way in New Jersey, but my sense is the only way that adult basic skills programs are going to see a reasonable level of support sustained over a period of years is if practitioners come together across all the various kinds of programs and commit themselves to organizing the state and getting adult learners involved. So, having said that, I'm going to give you just a couple of other things to think about. All the things that Hal said, all of the things that you have said, I completely agree with, and those are very important things to advocate for. There might be a few others. So, for example, if you have waiting lists, many states, in fact, nearly every state, has waiting lists of some length for English language learning services. So one of the things is to, and it very often comes as a shock to legislators when you tell them that their constituents are on a 3-month, 6-month, 9-month waiting list to learn English, and they then want to do something about that very often. Somebody mentioned early on increased quality, absolutely, and legislators are certainly going to be interested in that. And there's a good argument to be made, given that the bar has been raised. Certainly national standards have increased significantly over the past few years, and maybe the state standards have as well. And you could point that out and say, and our expenditures have gone up and our revenue has gone down. So we have a serious problem here. And I'm sure people are thinking about this, there are always services that adult learners need in addition to education services in order to regularly attend classes. So childcare, transportation, advising, access to counseling, and then of course getting their needs met for housing, food stamps, clothing, and other needed services.
David, can I chime in for 1 second? Can you go back to the previous slide?
Eric?
Yeah.
Yes, you can, but your voice is
Okay.
disappearing, so you might want to switch your
I'll switch my
technology.
microphones. Okay.
Yeah, I'll go back to the previous slide.
Okay. All right.
That one?
Yeah, is my voice? No, the next one. This one.
This one?
Yeah, my voice
Okay.
better now? So
yes, it's just fine.
Okay, so I think the counseling part is worth thinking a little bit more about too, because I think oftentimes counseling, particularly nowadays under WIOA, is thought of kind of instrumentally, like job counseling and sort of like the logistics of life, and not necessarily something like therapy. But while California did have that more money before, many schools had therapists, right, and were able to provide therapy to students and sort of psychological counseling as well as these other types of counseling. And I think that's a real need and a real issue that I think has started to be overlooked again.
Good point. Thanks, Eric.
Yep.
So I'm surprised nobody mentioned professional development. This is a big need across the country. Higher standards, more demands, high school equivalency tests that have higher standards and more demands, and teachers need help in learning how to meet those standards, particularly in writing and teaching writing, of course, and in math. And I should say in math, sometimes it's not just teaching math. Sometimes it's teachers who are teaching math who themselves are not comfortable with math and need help, need professional development desperately. And not just writing and math, in other areas as well. And as part of that, and some states do this, provide paid professional development time for teachers. Massachusetts has for many years provided, I think, for full-time teachers, 50 hours of paid professional development time per teacher. And that's open to a pretty wide variety of interpretations, including curriculum development time and things like that. You may know, but just in case you don't, 85% of the people teaching in our field are part-time. We need more full-time jobs and with benefits. And in some cases, particularly community-based organizations, not so much community college-sponsored or public school-sponsored, volunteer organizations, hardware and software is a big issue, and actual broadband access, sufficient access at the program. And then for all of these things, all the things you've mentioned, all the things I've just mentioned, requires funding. So increase funding for these kinds of services. Okay, so I want to shift now to the lessons learned part, and I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. If this is something you're particularly interested in, I'm going to give you a resource later. It's called the AAACE NLA, National Literacy Advocacy, WIGIO. WIGIO is a platform, a group platform, online platform. And what I'm going to be talking about right now actually comes from something that Art Ellison, the State Director in New Hampshire of Adult Basic Education, but also Art as a long-time leader of advocacy for adult basic skills in the United States, representing the State Directors Association. So Art thought about this question of, what have we learned? What have we learned from years of advocacy? And he has some interesting observations that I would like to share with you. The first one that has to do with a truth and justice approach, as he calls it, to adult education advocacy. And he says, the battle for the hearts and minds of policymakers will not be won with even the best research papers proving the utility of and the need for additional adult education funding. Two clear comments illustrate this point, and those are the comments. One is no one believes that adult education has a constituency that we need to pay attention to. So one very frank chair of a state House and Ways Means Committee said that, but frankly, many of them think that until we show them differently. And then the second is from President Jed Bartlett at West Wing. Those who show up make the decision. So interesting comments to think about. While we'd like to think that policymakers will support our work if they just understood the need for what we do, Art says, the real motivator for all elected policymakers are the views of their constituents. So truth and justice is great, but it doesn't matter. What really matters is truth and justice with 50 or 100 or 500 contacts from local constituents. That will work, as Art says, a hell of a lot better. He goes on to say, while the issue of money certainly comes into play in these circumstances, we should heed the recent words of Congressman Barney Frank on this matter. Frank said, it's widely believed that the biggest financial donors contribute so much money to the members of Congress that they can virtually dictate policy outcomes. This is simply wrong. Surprised? I was when I read this. Art goes on to say, money is very helpful in a political vacuum, but when members are forced to choose between their voters and their contributors, votes kick money's ass, quote unquote. Barney Frank, an autobiography. So Art has some other points. He has some thoughts about successful state-level advocacy campaigns. I'll share those with you. He also has some suggestions about the best way to build a national movement. I'm afraid you'll have to go online to get that part, and his thoughts about adult educators in politics. You'll have to go online to get that too, because we don't really have enough time to do that today. But I do want to share his thoughts about successful state-level advocacy campaigns. He says, the history of state-level advocacy campaigns is filled with successful efforts that have resulted in significant state expenditures for adult education programs. 75% of funding for adult education in the country comes from states, approximately 25% from the federal government. In addition, there are some very successful local campaigns for funding, like the recent effort in New York City. Almost all of these campaigns were built on the premise that if enough of a policymaker's constituents demand the members' support, they will most often work either for or support the request for additional resources. We're talking here about the amplification of student voices in the process, Art says. Over the years, the most successful adult education advocacy campaigns at the state level have consisted of 80% to 85% of the contacts with policymakers being made by students. So, a couple more things, and then I'm going to stop and give you a chance to ask questions or make further comments. Art Ellison made the point that to be effective in public policy advocacy, the field needs large numbers of advocates, ideally legislators' constituents. We understood that in Massachusetts beginning in the 1980s and still do. Organizing begins with our state Adult Basic Skills Professional Organization, the Massachusetts Coalition for Adult Education, and its Public Policy Committee, which has been ongoing for more than 2 decades now. It is essential to have a permanent group like this in every state, including New Jersey. Organizing the field year in and year out. In Massachusetts, we've also had an active adult learner organization working with the state practitioner organization. This is called the Massachusetts Association for Adult Learning. And it actually organizes the day at the State House and generally brings about 1,000 people to the State House, which is how we really got legislators' attention. I mean, literally, we crowded, and at one year, it was so large that the State House auditorium couldn't hold all the people. And so it had to be moved upstairs into a big forum area. And so 1,000 students marching through the halls of the State House, all the legislators' aides and some of the legislators came out of their offices. What's going on here? Who are these people? Why are they here? What's, is this a protest or what, And so we got their attention and have had their attention ever since. So another thing that is very helpful, and I mentioned this just briefly earlier, is what I referred to as legislative champions. It's not essential, but it really makes a difference if you have at least one who makes adult basic skills his or her number one issue. It's fabulous if you have 3, 4, 5 who make it in their top 5 issues. So in order for that to happen, you have to cultivate those legislators. And it's really programs working with their local legislators and also working with the state policy, public policy committee, letting them know, we have this legislator who's shown a real interest in adult literacy. And, we've told them how important it is to our students, and the students have told them that. What can we do? What more can we do? Can we do some other things? How do we make this guy or this woman our champion? And then the state policy committee can contact and also work with that person and see about organizing a legislative caucus around adult literacy, legislators who are all concerned or at least curious about what this issue is. So I think that's pretty much what I want to say. There's just a couple more things I want to let you know about, and then I'll stop talking and listen to you for a while. There are some interesting opportunities for 2017, and I'm sure most of you don't know about this. It's not public yet, so you will be among the first to have heard about this. PIAC is the international program on adult competencies. It's an assessment that has been given in all of the OECD countries. Think of this as an association of the well-to-do countries in the world, of which we are, the United States is a member. And so we have given this assessment in the United States to a relatively small, actually several small random samples of Americans, not of adult ed students. So this is a study of literacy, numeracy, and something called problem solving in technology-rich environments of Americans, not of adult ed students specifically. We have national data. We've had national data for a few years now. In 2017, probably in the spring, ETS is going to be issuing state data. So state by state, there will be data on how people, it's synthetic studies from the PIAC data, but you will be able, as advocates, to present this to state legislators. It's also very likely that later in the year in 2017, the National Center for Educational Statistics at the U.S. Department of Education will be providing county-level data, which is even more powerful in terms of persuading legislators, particularly in cities. You'll be able to go to city councils, you'll be able to go to people who are particular mayors and other administrators at the city level and show them exactly what the problem is. And by the way, I can tell you in advance, based on the national data, the United States did extremely poorly in adult literacy, pretty consistent with the NAL data and the NALS data before. We did worse in numeracy, and we did worse in problem solving in technology-rich environments. So we have a huge national problem that most legislators are not even aware of. They will be aware of it if you as an advocate and your students hand carry the data, the county data and the state data to them and sit down and talk about this, particularly if you can talk about people on waiting lists and if you can talk about what program services are available for the constituents in your community. So I'll leave you with this thought. Legislators care about data, especially if it's about their constituents. And they care even more if it's presented by their constituents.
Hal,
So
and
let's see if there's some questions or comments.
yeah, Hal, I know that you had wanted to chime in, but before you do, Regina had passed along before her formula for successful advocacy was story plus data plus relationships. So having that narrative, having the information there, but then also having the learners there to kind of, I think, develop those relationships, and for the advocates to develop the relationships with people, I think, as well.
That's great. I completely agree.
Um,
Excellent.
Regina was also wondering if you thought that there's any risk that they're going to blame ABE for the PIAC results.
That's a great question. No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Because and if they do, it's very easy to answer. No, this is not about ABE. This is a random sample, national data, and there's some other samples focusing on corrections and on unemployed youth. So there's some specific population studies that are also random samples, and new reports that are coming out on that.
Okay. Hal, did you want to chime in with some ideas?
Yes, I just wanted to emphasize I think one of David's excellent points. I think this is a tremendous presentation. And that is about the truth and justice approach. Our approach in New Jersey, because perhaps we're working through the system, has been every time we want something, we have a study group and we write a report. And that report, those reports say basically the same thing. I've been part of all of them going back to the 80s. Then that report goes to somebody, typically the governor, maybe the agency head. They all dance up and down, and we say they can't possibly ignore this. That has got us nothing. I think those kinds of things are important only if they're part of a broad campaign that hits all the other parts that David talked about, especially the part about having learners carry the message for us. I say that with a great deal of frustration because I spent a lot of time doing those kinds of things, and my colleagues have, Eric has, but we just can't take that approach of sending a message out to important people and think that's going to have any impact whatsoever.
I agree.
Yes, absolutely.
I agree. All right, so we're just about at the top of the hour. Any other comments, suggestions, questions, whether more generally about ideas of public policy advocacy, this kind of long-range goal advocacy and not just the triage crisis advocacy, either nationally or in New Jersey, or things that you think that NJOL can do better in terms of getting people around the state aware and engaged and feel some ownership of public policy advocacy efforts. We have the conference, the yearly conference. We have these webinars. The board is in the process of developing some one-pagers about 4 or 5 different really key issues that we'll be able to disseminate across the state, and then hopefully people will pick up and start talking about. But we really need to galvanize people across the state.
I'll leave you with one final thought, actually, from Art Ellison. He posted a message yesterday to all of the state directors and other advocates across the country, in which he says, now that we have seen the results of the election, one of the possibilities, he didn't say that this would happen, but one of the possibilities is that when the president releases his budget, which typically is in February, but it could be later for a new president, could be March or April. It's possible that the entire federal line item for WIOA Title II could be wiped out. And obviously he and other advocates who are attuned to what's happening at the national level will be paying very close attention to see if that actually is a realistic possible scenario. If so, Art says, we are going to have to mobilize across the country in ways that we have never mobilized before. We will have a mammoth crisis. Our system will shut down if that happens. So we'll see. We'll see if that happens. I mean, there were lots of concerns when Reagan took power years ago that the Department of Education was going to be wiped out. He said it was going to be eliminated. It never was. It was cut, to be sure. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, but it is anything really is possible now, right? So we'll see.
Well, and I think that means to be proactive now, reaching out to your representatives and saying, hey, we owe adult education funding really matters, and
Yes.
get ahead of the axe if the
Yes,
axe is being
absolutely.
picked up.
Good point.
Yeah. So
So there are a couple of resources that I've left up on a slide. If you wanted to get more involved, learn more about adult basic skills advocacy, these are two resources that might be helpful to you.
all right. So right. So Thomas is pointing out, before legislators cut our programs, we need to get people on a bus to Trenton. Indeed. I think that's I think that's a big issue. And I think, to kind of cycle back to this question of getting learners in front of the topic, I'm currently involved with Make the Road New Jersey, which is in Elizabeth, and they work with immigrants in the Elizabeth area, and they've been working to get municipal IDs issued by the mayor, or issued by the town, and they've gotten in the mayor a champion for it. But they also have been relentless in getting learners to City Hall, to walk through City Hall, to write testimony. They had an event in the spring where the learners had written in English kind of posters that had their photos and then their story underneath their photo. They invented the mayor. They invited a local rep to come in, see the students' faces, see their stories, and then while it was up for a vote before the city, I worked with some students and we created a video where they testified why municipal IDs would be important. They shared that, and then Make the Road shared one of those stories like per day on their website, on their Facebook page. So, and I think they're going to get it. I mean, I think that it went through the first read very positively, and I think they're going to get it. And so part of that is that they've had learners themselves and the adults themselves out in the forefront meeting those legislators and making the case for themselves. So I will be uploading this to the Angel YouTube channel, and I'll send out the PDFs, and also the certificate of participation. I'd like to thank everybody for coming today and participating and sharing your ideas. And we're all in this together moving forward. All right. So Joe Hill says, "Don't mourn, organize." Right. So
Perfect.
yeah, so let's organize together in New Jersey, and then also join larger efforts across the country. So thanks everybody for coming.